more focused session, please. Requesting everyone to come at the front. Please do not leave any empty spaces. Ready? Good morning to you all. Welcome to the day 3 of Palm Conference and Seminar Program. We begin this conference with the first day of the session, Getting Your Studio Atmos HE Ready by Mr. Bhaskar Pal. This session is powered by Neumann India, and before we start this session, I would like to play a small clip AV of Neumann India.
So save my life.
Hey, dude. Good.
1, 2. No, perfect.
Let's do this.
Hey, see ya. What's going on?
All good?
I love it.
Random loom back into.
We thank Neumann India for sponsoring this video. It's my honor to invite Mr. Bhaskar Pal. Please come on stage, sir. Bhaskar Pal is the content lead, India, ME, Africa at Dolby India. He's a graduate of the Film and Television Institute of Pune, India, having specialized in sound recording and sound engineering. He joined Dolby as a sound consultant in the year 2000, and his experience spans over 2 decades in the film and television industry in various capacities. He presently leads the content team in Dolby, supporting content creation across India, ME, and Africa for music, online digital, which is your OTT, and broadcast ecosystems in Dolby Atmos and Dolby Vision HDR. He is also engaged in imparting training to partners and conducting workshops and webinars on content creation with Dolby technology. Can we have a huge round of applause for Mr. Bhaskar?
Thank you.
Please take away.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. And thanks to Palm for allowing me this opportunity to talk about this topic today, about how to get your studio Dolby Atmos HE ready. Thank you, everybody present here today for making it to this session. And I mean, the Dolby Atmos has been, growing since the last 10 years. I'll be talking a little short and brief history about Dolby in a while. And we constantly get a lot of requests about, talking about how to set up a studio, what are the basic requirements, what are the things to be taken care of, and so on and so forth. So I think this is the right kind of a topic today, and also the right platform where most professionals from the audio industry are present here. So hopefully that will be beneficial to all of you. So let's get started. I mean, very briefly, I'll be talking a little bit about introduction to Atmos, and then I'll be talking about the basic building blocks, what are the requirements that we need to focus on about the studio setup. And then I'll be diving a little deeper into some of the aspects so that, that those are mostly frequently asked questions around those topics. And obviously, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the importance of monitor tuning, because that is something we have, kind of found a lot of value and about how it helps in the translation of the content. So that is very important, and there are some very basic, common sense things which people tend to overlook. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the relevance of the binaural headphone monitoring in the context of the studio setup. So that's the basic agenda, and I think if some of you attended yesterday's session by Srijesh, you must have had a deep dive or deeper understanding of binaural mixes and binaural monitoring. So that is not what I'll try to, I mean, you already heard all that. So let's just proceed with, how the whole journey of Atmos started. So as you can see, or as you might recall, Dolby Atmos was a technology which was designed for the cinemas, bringing a more immersive surround experience than was possible earlier with the traditional channel-based surround system that we were, familiar with. So 2012 is when it was introduced in the cinemas, and Disney's Brave was the first movie title that was released in Dolby Atmos. So today we are in 2022. It's exactly 10 years that cinematic Atmos, started its journey, and you'll be surprised how soon. I mean, as early as 2015 is when Atmos as a technology moved from the big screen experience in cinemas to the small living room or home theater setup, which was almost every person's living room, or personal home theater. So you had the technology which would now allow you to sit at home and enjoy the same cinematic experience in full immersive surround sound. And as you see along this 10-year journey, most of our pro partners, that is the technology enablers, on the software side, on the hardware side, have adopted and enabled Atmos in their systems or in their software tools. So, and then one more advancement, I mean, you started with the cinema, then you had Atmos for home or OTT content, which is the focus today of today's session. I mean, how you set up the studio to create content in a near-field Atmos mix setup, specifically for OTT or Atmos Music. So talking about Atmos Music, so this is something much more new. It was only somewhere around in 2020 that Atmos Music was launched, and it has since then gained a huge momentum and popularity. So that's the brief history, and just to give you a sense of, how well Atmos has been adopted. So at Dolby, we always look at the entire ecosystem, or what we call the content ecosystem. So on the extreme left-hand side, you would see, the studios or the content creators, and then in the middle, you will notice all the distributors that help to take that content and finally deliver it over different platforms to the end user. And as you can see, a whole lot of services today support Dolby Atmos, including some of the top OTT services in India, as well as some of the music streaming services. And on the extreme right, what you see is the final device ecosystem, as we call it, or the experience part of the ecosystem. That is where the end user gets to experience the immersive surround sound. For that, you need all these devices that should support the format. And as you can see, you have like all sorts of devices. You have televisions, you have AV receivers, sound bars, you have gaming stations, you have mobile devices, pretty much anything that you can think of. So just to give you a kind of background on how Atmos has grown in this last 10 years and how it has gone beyond cinema, and now you can actually experience it from your mobile device in your pocket. I mean, that's where we are today. And obviously, one thing was about the gaming. That also has a huge potential going ahead. So getting back to the main topic, I'll talk about the basic building blocks. Oops, okay, I think something happened to some of the fonts. So the whole list, yeah. So obviously, the very beginning or the very starting point is the space, the room that you're looking at to set up the mix facility or the mixing room. And we'll be talking about these in a little details later. So we'll just quickly go through the bullet points, I mean the main building blocks. Then obviously you need your main mixing tools, the DAW, and all the associated hardware or other software paraphernalia to go with it. Now, most importantly, you would need the Dolby Atmos renderer. When you're mixing something in Dolby Atmos, the heart of this entire system is the Dolby Atmos renderer. And what it does is to kind of take all the multiple tracks that are there in your mix. I'll be talking about it in a little more detail in one of the later slides. Basically, compared to a traditional channel-based mix, in Atmos, the master output from the DAW would have up to 128 tracks or channels of audio information. And that obviously cannot directly go to your monitoring system, because in a small room, like a near-field mix setup that we are talking about today, you will see that the minimum recommended monitor configuration is what we call the 7.1.4 speaker configuration. So if you have just 12 speakers in the room, and if you have 128 outputs in your mix session, you can't map them to the monitoring, right? So that is where the renderer comes in between. It sits in between. It takes all the inputs. It looks at what is the speaker configuration in the room, and then it renders the mix in real time. The mix is being done as a creative process by the mix engineer, but you end up with more number of tracks, and that is because Atmos is a format which is based on object-based surround sound, as we call it. And if you're not familiar with what object-based surround sound means, just raise your hand so that I get a sense of how much I need to expand on this stuff. So, okay. So I think I will explain it in a little bit more, but that actually goes into more of the mixing part of Atmos. So, but I'll have to, just give you a little brief about it. And then obviously you need the main important part of your tools, that is the monitor speakers. That is what you'll be listening to your mixes on, and that is very, very important. And lastly, which is often overlooked, and in the many years that I have been associated with various studios, this is the component that is missing in a lot of places, the monitor controller. And what does this do? It does multiple things, but basically it kind of preserves all the settings for the monitor speakers in one single place, and which also allows, multiple configurations to be saved if required. I'll explain that in the later slides. And without this, you will not have a properly tuned monitoring system in the room. So this is a very critical part of the room setup as well. So these are the basic building blocks. I won't be talking in detail about the workstation and the associated hardware because that most of you are familiar with. What I will explain a little more in detail is the considerations for the room and the monitoring and the monitor tuning. Those are some of the most important things. And I'll explain a little bit more about the object-based Atmos concept. So in real life, when we listen to anything, we perceive sound to come from all around us, from any direction, either in front of us, behind us, above us, and we always perceive, the source of sound to be a point source somewhere in this three-dimensional space around us. It is always a point source, and this is the most critical part. When we try to create a mix in the studio, we always work with a set of tracks. And like most of you will be familiar, you often end up using stereo tracks. So when you have a stereo track, you're basically always putting the source as two channels of sound. And if you're mixing only in stereo, it generally goes to left-right. When you're mixing in Atmos, you have more options. But the point is, in a channel-based output, this two-channel information for every source of sound actually causes a basic problem. That is, depending on where you're seated in this environment or in the space, you will perceive that source of sound to be different. So if you listen to if you're present in Srijesh's session yesterday, you would have heard about how Srijesh discussed about the perception of sound from two speakers. So obviously, the way we listen to sound is using two ears, and if you have two different sources, you'll have multiple, images of that sound being created by the arrival of the sound waves from the two different speakers, causing, and that will keep changing depending on where you are positioned in the listening space. And that image of the sound will constantly shift because of that. So to avoid this is an inherent drawback of a channel-based surround system or reproduction. And to kind of get over this, we introduced the concept of object-based audio. So like we perceive each element of sound in real life as a point source, you can now take elements of sound in your mix session and treat it as an object. So you just take it and place it in the three-dimensional space wherever you think it should be appearing to come from. And that is achieved by using the Dolby Atmos 3D panner. We'll talk about that later. And this helps to position the sound in this 3D space, locked to your reference position where you're listening to from. And that is the beauty. You can have multiple such objects floating around in the room. If you see this model over here, that's the room that you see. And all the green dots that you see are actually different sound elements which are positioned or placed in that 3D space. And you can actually perceive them coming from all those different directions. You can also perceive whether they're near, whether they're far. So that is the concept of object-based, immersive surround. So let's look at, some of the details of the actual building blocks. So let's start with the room. And when we talk about room, when we get inquiries from various facilities that wish to upgrade the room, the first question that generally I ask is, what is the size of the room? And, so size of the room is very important or critical. We are talking about near-field mixed rooms. So near-field mixed rooms typically should not be too big or too small. Both extremes can create problems. Uh, but today I will also introduce a new term which most of you may not be familiar with. So when we talk about the room size, we generally consider the shell of the room. That is the basic wall structure of the room. And that is when we measure wall to wall, that's the room dimensions. What you see as the broad rectangle, the thick border rectangle, that is the room structure or the walls. And when you measure the length of those walls, you get the room length and the room width. Now, when you place your speakers inside that room, the diagram has been, intentionally exaggerated a little bit to kind of make that layout look much smaller, so that you understand the difference between the speaker layout length, width, and height, and the room length, width, and height. So we'll talk about it also in a little more detail in the next slide. So you see the dimensions marked with the yellow circles are the room dimensions, so the length and width, and then we have the speaker layout width, the speaker layout length, and the mix position distance. So these are some critical distances or distance parameters that we need to make note of to start with. Similarly, if you look at the section view to understand what the height of the room is, so the physical height of the room would be this, the actual ceiling, whatever it is, a solid or a temporary ceiling. And then you have the speaker layout height. So that is from the mixed floor level to the acoustic center of the overhead speakers. That's the speaker layout height. So these terms are new, speaker layout length, width, and height. And just keep in mind, this is very, very important. And you'll know why in just a few seconds. So talking about the room shell size, again, like we said, too big a room also does not really do justice, and a too small a room will obviously, not allow you to listen to your mix properly. People keep asking what's the ideal, room dimension. There is, no really ideal room dimension, but what you see on the screen now is roughly, what can work pretty well. So shell size, now I'm talking about the basic shell of the room, so the bare walls. Anything which has, any room that has length of about 18 to 21 feet, can be more, and which has a width of at least about 15 to 18 feet and a height of 10 to 12 feet, will be a very decent room size to start with. You can probably go a little smaller, but it all depends on, what kind of room are you trying to build. Are you trying to build a one engineer, just mix room where you sit and mix, nobody else needs to come in, then you can look at the smallest configuration maybe. If you want to walk into the room and say, wow, what a nice room. You have nice seating for the producer as well, for the clients. And you have a feeling of a little bit of openness in the room. Then you'll have to look for, a slightly bigger space. So there's nothing technical about it. It's more about, what gives you a good vibe, what gives you the good aesthetics. And obviously there is slight technicality to it. If you have a little bit of distance from which you can listen to the monitor speakers, and if the room is not too small or too big, but resembles an average living room that a person as an end user might be having, then you're close to, almost a matching environment for the room. And then the next question comes, what is the minimum? Everybody wants to start with the minimum first, yeah. So the minimum that we recommend, and now we are not talking about the room dimensions. This is where it becomes important that you understand why I explained what is the speaker layout width and speaker layout length and height. Because the room can be any shape and size, but how you place the monitors in that room is what is more critical. So the speaker layout length should not be less than 11.5 feet. That's the minimum that we recommend. Similarly, the speaker layout width, that is the separation between the two side surrounds, that should not be less than 10 feet. And the height from the mixed level floor to the overhead speaker acoustic center, that should not be less than 8 feet. So these are the minimum. Now if you'll actually measure such a room and see, when you start physically placing speakers with these dimensions, you have to consider the depth of the speaker itself. So if you take even like 1 feet or maybe say 15 inches for the depth of the speaker as an average, and you do just a simple mathematics, you'll see that you'll end up with the room wall, the wall separation has to be at least another 2.5 feet more on each side. Similarly, that's why when I talked about the shell size, I considered the slightly bigger dimensions. So this is the minimum. Again, can you fit in all your furniture that you want in that room? That has to do with your sense of aesthetics, how you want to design the studio, what is the look that you want, what is the feel that you want. So this is the minimum, and we don't have a maximum in that sense, but what we say is, now if you paid attention to the mix distance, that is the distance of the mix position or the listening position from the center speaker. So we say that this should not exceed 4 meters or roughly 12 feet. If it exceeds that, it becomes, the room will be a bit too big for a near field, kind of a mixed room. Nothing wrong with it, but it will not be optimized as a near field mixed room. You'll need bigger monitors to be able to achieve the necessary sound pressure level or volume at the mix position, and then it all starts looking a little messy, plus your budgets will also go up. So now the room geometry, typically most rooms are rectangular in shape, can be a little non-rectangular also. The most ideal room is a diamond-shaped room, and if you looking at in terms of the best acoustics. But in practical world, you hardly get a diamond-shaped room to mix in. Most rooms will be kind of rectangle. Some can be squarish. So a rectangular room which has the length dimension greater than the width, that is a more ideal room. A squarish room will tend to have more problems in terms of acoustics of that space. So that is generally avoidable. And when I'm talking about the room dimensions, so there are certain golden room ratios. You can just look up on the net, you'll see what details you can find out. But this chart that you see, this graph, kind of gives you a sense of where or how your room dimensions can fit in to give you acceptable acoustical performance in that space. And the most ideal, which may or may not be achieved, is that orange spot. So if you see the two axes, you'll see it mentions the height to width ratio on the y-axis and the length to width ratio on the bottom x-axis. So basically, if you look at a room that you're starting to build from scratch, this is a very good point to start with to decide what would be the ideal room length, width, and height. Because if you start with any fixed, just say, for example, you take, okay, I need 21 feet as the length of the room. So you look at the length to width ratio at the bottom, and you will see, the most ideal is somewhere near 1.5, which means that if your width was X, your length was Y, then your Y has to be 1.5 times the width. So if you started with a length of 21 feet, that was your decision as to which dimension you want to start with. Then your width has to be roughly about 1.5, so 14 feet, okay? And similarly, you can calculate what the height should be, but the height should not drop below 10 feet because we are looking at near-field mixed room where overhead speakers have to be now considered. When you are mixing in 5.1 or 7.1 or plain stereo, you do not have overhead speakers, so that really did not matter. Now, because you're mixing in Atmos, you will have physical overhead speakers, so you can't really compromise on the height too much. So that's why if your room ratios kind of dictate the height to be less than 8 feet or 10 feet for all practical purposes based on that orange dot, which is the ideal ratio, then you move away from that to keep it at 10 feet. And all of these basically have to do with the acoustical performance of the room. So the golden ratios determine what the room modes will be and how can you optimize the acoustical performance of the space. So this is not a discussion on the acoustics of the space. I think there's a session later in the afternoon by Rollins who will be talking specifically about acoustical performances of various recording spaces. So please attend that. You will have lot more information in depth about these aspects. Next, obviously, I mentioned about the DAW and the other tools like the Atmos renderer and the Atmos panner tool, the 3D Atmos panner tool. So these are again important building blocks. I won't talk much about the DAW because you have pretty much all the popular DAWs today support Atmos. They're all enabled, starting with Avid Pro Tools, Steinberg, Cubase, Nuendo. Then you have Logic, you have Ableton Live. These are more popular for the music mix engineers and music composers. You have Pyramix. So, and then there is support for Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve. So that also supports Atmos. So pretty much most popular DAWs that exist today support Atmos. And I'll talk a little more about the renderer. I already mentioned that the renderer, the Dolby Atmos renderer is the heart of the whole Atmos, mixing, Atmos playback workflow. So as you can see, when you mix or create content in Atmos, like I mentioned, you can have up to 128 tracks in the final output from your session. And those tracks will be a combination of what we call beds and objects. Objects, I explained, they are all individual elements of audio. And beds are something you're already familiar with, only the term now is kind of new. So beds basically means when you mix a whole bunch of audio elements in your session and distribute it in a channel-based output, like the traditional 5.1. So you have fixed the distribution of a particular sound into this 6-channel output. You fix the ratios, how it will be distributed, where is it going to? Is it going to the left channel or to the right surround channel or somewhere in between? So that is the bed. In Atmos, typically we have a 10-channel bed. Now you might be wondering why. Because in Atmos, we have a traditional 7.1 configuration, and then we expanded on the height axis to add 2 feeds to the overheads. So you have a left top overhead and a right top overhead. So those 2 additional channels can also be utilized in a bed or in a channel-based distribution of your audio element. So you end up having a 10-channel bed. Now, we can have one single bed, or we can have multiple beds. Or anybody who's a mixing engineer here will know you generally create multiple stems. You have separate dialogue, music, effects, and so on. And that is the benefit of having separate beds. So you can have a dialogue bed, you can have a music bed, effects bed. And then the rest of them are individual objects. So the bed is basically what you see in that purple bar with those occasionally lighting up green dots. And all the other green dots that you see are actually the objects. And total you can have up to 128 outputs in an Atmos master or a mix. So you have a combination of multiple beds and objects. Now this comes into the renderer. So that is what you're seeing here. This is the user interface of the renderer. And what you see on this extreme left are the inputs. So it just shows you what are the incoming audio signals into the renderer. And then what you see next to it in the meter bar is what is going out of the renderer to your monitoring. In this case, if you see, we have the monitoring layout for the room selected as 5.1.4. I mean, this is not very clear. There's option here to select the format of monitoring. So you can select how many, what is the output format from the renderer, and that will typically be based on the number of speakers set up in the room. And like I mentioned earlier, 7.1.4 is our minimum recommended monitor layout. So typically you would have 12 channel meter bar over there showing the respective output to each of the speakers. And then you have this room model which shows you how the various objects, so all the objects that you see here, all lighted up, those are also seen in this room model, and gives you a real-time sense of how you have actually placed them in your mix in this three-dimensional space, and if they're moving, how are they moving. So that's, the renderer does the main job of taking all the audio information in your mix and doing a real-time output matching to your room speaker configuration. Now this is important because you can take the same mix to different rooms with different speaker configuration, and you will still hear the mix very similarly. Supposing you have a room which is quite small, you have only 5.1.4 as you can see in this one. The renderer knows exactly how to take all that audio information and render it to only these 10 outputs so that you hear the mix correctly. If you went to a 7.1.4 where you have 12 outputs, it will render it differently so that you have the audio information going to the different channels, but the mix sounds the same. Similarly, there are other higher configurations. You have 9.1.6. You can go up to 22 channels, 22 channel outputs. Generally, not feasible in a near-field mixed room, but I mean, if somebody wanted to, they could. So the renderer does a very, very big job of doing a real-time, creating a real-time render for your monitoring, how you will be monitoring the mix that you're doing accurately. And there are two versions of the renderer. One is a dedicated hardware-based renderer, which we call the home theater RMU, rendering and mastering unit. That's what RMU stands for. And then we have the software-only version of it, which can run on your main computer system where you're running your DAW. And it'll do pretty much the same job with a few limitations, which are kind of beyond the scope of today's discussion. So that is actually a part of the discussion when we talk about how Atmos mix is done. Just a few minor differences. Most of the functions are similar, and so even if you're working with the software renderer only, you can pretty much do almost everything that you would want to do in your Atmos mix. And then the Atmos Spanner tool. Now, When we first introduced Dolby Atmos, the whole concept of this object-based audio was totally new. None of the existing DAWs, the software tools, or the hardware consoles had the ability to handle this, additional information. And to be able to distribute the audio of these multiple individual audio elements that were supposed to be placed in this three-dimensional space. So that was the necessity of the Atmos panel, to be able to position those audio elements in the mix correctly, the way you wanted it. That was created as a separate plugin tool that could be used in any of the DAWs that supported. I mean, Avid Pro Tools was the only software to start with. Now you have support for all the major DAWs like I mentioned. And today, interestingly, most of the DAWs have their own integrated 3D panning solutions. So you may or may not need this. In music software like Logic and Ableton, which are primarily intended for music mixing and have only recently kind of updated to support Atmos, still have a basic channel-based architecture. So there, they do not have the integrated 3D panner, and there you would still need this 3D panner tool. It's called the Atmos Music Panner because this version of the panner that you see on the screen now has additional sequencer built into it, so which can automate a lot of your pan movements. And the beauty of this panner is all those sequencing can be set to the bar and beat of the music. So it's a great tool to pan a lot of your automation, automate a lot of your pans with the sequencing. So, and always please make a note of this. Always, whenever you are looking for more information, or if you want to go and refresh some of your knowledge, professionalsupport.dolby.com. This you can just bookmark, keep it. We have tons of information, video tutorials, white papers, best practices guides, everything that you can think of. And we also have forums where, people are discussing, what, they are experiencing, some challenges or issues that they might be facing. Somebody else has already solved it. So you will find a lot of answers to your questions on the website. And I always recommend that this is the first site you should go to and explore. And if you don't find the necessary information there, please feel free to reach out to us. So that's about the renderer part. And so we've discussed the room, the basic tools to start creating your mix. That's the DAW and the renderer. And now let's look at the monitoring part of it. Yes, you want to say something? Just keep a note of it. We'll do the Q&A in the end. So we'll take all the question answers at that, because they would be able to also, hand over the mics to you at that point. So quickly moving over to the monitoring requirements and what should be paid attention to, because I think we are kind of a little late. So typically, we always recommend using the same, model of speakers as much as possible. The main reasons are, if you use the same kind of speakers, you'll always have the same tonal quality, for each of the channels that are being, output. Sometimes, it might be a challenge to be able to accommodate the same model of speaker for the fronts and for the sides and rears, as well as for the overheads, because of the space constraints. And also, you might be thinking of optimizing how the placement of the monitor can be done, because you might have an existing room, where you have a certain position of the door or a window. So those can all be a bit of a challenge. So it may be necessary to use a slightly smaller model from the same family of speakers for the overheads, for example, and sometimes maybe for the side or rear surrounds. But generally, we do not recommend mix and match of completely different brands of speakers or different models from different manufacturers. You will never end up having a balanced tonal reproduction from all the channels. So that is the basic requirement. Then when you talk about the speaker choice, I'll have a detailed demo of a nice tool that we have, which is called the Dolby Audio Design, Dolby Audio Room Design Tool. So that will explain a few more things about how we consider the power of the speaker and the SPL capacity that is required at the mix position. So those are additional things. And obviously, when you're creating the design of the room, if you know what monitor speaker you're starting with, that is a great help because you can go and find out what is the dispersion pattern of the speaker. What kind of dispersion is it a very narrow or is it wide enough? So you can then decide on how the coverage of the listening area would be, using different types of monitors. You can compare and see that very well. So that is about, just some of the criteria to decide on which kind of speakers to be used. Next is the actual speaker layout. And this I mentioned before, 7.1.4 is the minimum that we recommend to be able to, faithfully judge your mix and be able to experience the true, pans and movements and all the, imaging of the audio that you're trying to create. But there is no limitation in that sense. I mean, the Atmos renderer, like I explained earlier, is very, very flexible. So if you have a smaller monitor configuration, it will still render the mix as faithfully as possible, and you will kind of hear the same, experience. But generally, when you go down, it will kind of have a little compromise. If you go up, then that's fine. So if you have a 916, for example, it just means that you have a few more speakers in the room, filling up some of the empty portions that were there compared to 714, which means now you'll have even better resolution of the reproduced sound. So the imaging will become a little more accurate because, for example, earlier, there were no wide surrounds. So the 916 adds a pair of wide surrounds just outside the left and right, but between the left and the left surround or the right and the right surround. So that space earlier would be kind of empty. And if you actually wanted to place some audio in that particular zone, there was no physical speaker reproducing it. The renderer would render it in a way that it would be reproduced accurately, but when you have a physical speaker in that same location, the imaging is even more solid. So that is the benefit. And 514, what you see is, like Shijesh mentioned yesterday, it's typically something that was designed for broadcast operations where they do live Atmos for like sporting events mostly. And this is entirely outcome of the physical space that is available. So most of the broadcast work happens in OB vans, which is like a really, really tiny space. However best you try, it will be almost impossible to fit in a 714 kind of a speaker. So that's a kind of a small compromise that is acceptable, but it's not recommended for any other mix environment. Now quickly, how do you place your speakers? Ideally, everything should be at ear level. So acoustic center of the speakers should be at ear level for all the speakers, your fronts, sides, rears. And the overhead speakers should be placed in a way that I mean, there are guidelines for where they will be placed, but when they are positioned there, they should all be aiming towards the mixed position like all other speakers. And I mean, these are commonly known stuff. When you aim the speakers, you don't aim exactly in the middle of the head. You aim it towards the shoulders, so the right side of the speakers would aim towards the right shoulder. The left side of the speakers would aim roughly towards your left shoulder. So you have a slightly wider sweet spot, and you have less of a imaging issue when you aim the speakers in that way. So that's about the placement. When you see the dart tool, you'll realize that, we'll talk a little more about the placement. And then there are guidelines for how the speakers should be set up in terms of the angular separation. I won't go into the details. I think you're already running pretty late. So again, most of these specifications are related to the ITU specs that are globally, accepted and just expanded from the 5.1 to now accommodate more number of channels. And there are guidelines of, how you can place the overheads, how, if you have to take the speakers a little higher than the ear level, how much can you go? So there are guidelines for that as well. And if you see, you can go to the website, and there's a guide which is called the Dolby Atmos HE Studio Technical Guide. And you will be able to, study in more details if you're really interested. I talked about the DART tool just now. So that's the Dolby Audio Room Design Tool, or DART tool in short. This is something which we have developed, and it's in constant development. Keep updating this tool every few months. This is an Excel-based tool, very easy to use, very intuitive, and there are a lot of help files. I mean, in the tool itself. So if you are not able to understand, you can just hover over certain cells, and you will be prompted with the necessary, help features. And if we have time, I can show you that this DART tool has a lot of very powerful features, packed into it. Again, this is a free download. If you are very interested, you can download this from the site. And let me see if I can do a quick demo of this tool. So this tool I had already pre-populated. Where is this? This doesn't come up. It's gone at the back. Okay. It doesn't want to come up. I might have to pause this. I will have to